why your brain keeps you insecure and how to rewire it. You don't feel insecure because something is wrong with you. You feel insecure because your brain has learned that being yourself might cost you something, that people might withdraw, that you might be misread, that the moment you let your guard down, something could go wrong, and so you keep editing yourself even when no one is watching. You doubt what you just said. You reanalyze what you meant. You replay small moments in your mind, scanning for a flaw you can't quite name. You call it insecurity, but what you're really feeling is an internal conflict between who you are and what your brain thinks you have to be to stay safe. That's why it doesn't go away with logic. You can tell yourself you're enough. You can collect evidence, rehearse mantras, even fake it till you make it, but something deeper stays active, something wired into how you predict the world, read the room, and interpret silence. This is not just a mindset. It's a protective loop, one where the nervous system quietly prepares for rejection, even when no threat is present, one where shrinking becomes automatic, not because you want to, but because your brain thinks it's safer that way. And unless you understand why your brain developed this loop, you'll keep trying to fix your confidence by fighting the wrong thing. Because this isn't about confidence. It's about safety and the cost your mind believes you'll pay if you stop performing. Your brain doesn't fear visibility because it's irrational. It fears visibility because at any point being fully seen came with a cost. And it remembered the human nervous system is built for adaptation. It watches what creates tension, what brings connection, what triggers withdrawal, and it adjusts, not by asking for your permission, but by optimizing your behavior for survival. If, early on, being expressive made someone uncomfortable, you learned to mute yourself. If your needs were too much for someone else to handle, you learned to minimize. If showing your real feelings led to conflict, you learned to smile instead. Each time, your brain registered a pattern. Being fully myself puts me at risk. So it did what it was designed to do. It built a protective association, where shrinking, pleasing, or staying vague became safety strategies. You didn't choose insecurity. Your brain installed it as a filter between you and the world. And that filter still operates, even when your circumstances change. You might be in a different room, with safer people, or no threat at all. But your nervous system doesn't use reason. It uses emotional memory. So even in a conversation where nothing is wrong, you still feel that urge to retreat, to over-explain, to stay one step ahead of rejection that isn't happening. This is why so many intelligent, capable people feel a deep sense of hesitation they can't fully explain. It's not about lacking skill or logic. It's about having a brain that misidentifies being visible as being unsafe and responds as if your survival depends on managing how you're perceived. And unless you recognize this response for what it is, a defense, not a fact, you'll keep reading your current life through the lens of an outdated threat map. Because that's how insecurity hides. Not in obvious fear, but in subtle reflexes. A quiet flinch before speaking, a mental edit mid-sentence, a sudden urge to withdraw from your own opinion. These are not personality traits. They are neural adaptations that once served a purpose, but now prevent you from inhabiting your full presence. The brain doesn't just store facts. It stores meaning, not just what happened, but what it meant about you at the time. This is the foundation of emotional memory, and one of the most overlooked reasons insecurity feels so real, even in situations that seem safe. Imagine being a child and expressing a thought, a feeling, or a need, only to be met with mockery, dismissal, or silence. Your brain doesn't file that moment under bad day. It encodes it as a prediction template. This is what happens when I speak up. This is what love feels like: uncertain, earned, unstable. This is who I must be to avoid being hurt again. These associations form early, often before we have language to explain them, and they shape how we relate to ourselves in adulthood. You may not remember the moment clearly, but your brain does, and it recreates that emotional logic every time you approach situations that feel vaguely similar. interviews, social settings, conversations with people who remind you of that early instability. You start editing yourself, not because you're unsure, but because the body recognizes the conditions, and without realizing it, you become less of yourself, not to deceive others, but to stay safe inside a logic that was never consciously chosen. This is how self-doubt becomes a default, even when you know you're competent. Your frontal cortex might say, "I've got this." But your limbic system still believes it's walking into danger. So your voice tightens. Your thoughts speed up. You scan the environment, not for connection, but for cues of disapproval, and you shrink accordingly. Over time, this becomes your emotional baseline. Not terror, not panic, just a low-grade tension. The quiet anticipation that something about you might be too much, or not enough. And here's the part most people miss. You don't feel this because you're failing. You feel this because your brain is loyal to an old meaning it once created to keep you safe. But loyalty to a past survival strategy is not the same as clarity. And the more you see these patterns for what they are, memories, not truths, the more space you gain to choose how you want to exist now. Not all insecurity comes from major events. Much of it is built silently, through small, repeated experiences that the brain strings together into a narrative of who you need to be. A raised eyebrow when you spoke, a pause that felt like disapproval. A compliment that came only after you performed. Moments too subtle to call traumatic, but frequent enough to shape your identity. This is how micro-experiences become the architecture of long-term self-doubt. Your brain isn't looking for accuracy. It's looking for patterns. And once it finds one, especially one tied to emotional discomfort, it locks it in, not as a conscious belief, but as a background prediction. Be careful here, don't be too much. Tone it down. You start anticipating the world, not as it is, but as it was filtered through the lens of repeated emotional signals. Your body becomes fluent in subtle contractions, holding your breath before speaking, softening your opinion, avoiding eye contact, not because you're shy, but because your brain has practiced this posture of protection. And the more often you do it, the less you notice it. It stops feeling like a decision and starts feeling like who you are. This is what makes insecurity so hard to spot. It doesn't arrive as fear. It arrives as normal. As the way you speak, sit, interact, apologize. And unless you pause and trace it back to its origins, you'll keep mistaking adaptation for authenticity. But you weren't born uncertain. You learned to be. Not because you misunderstood the world, but because the world gave you signals you couldn't ignore. And your brain, being efficient, recorded them. What you're feeling now isn't weakness. It's the echo of thousands of small corrections, practiced over years, until your nervous system decided, this is the version of you that keeps you safe. The good news is, if your brain learned insecurity through repetition, it can unlearn it the same way through repeated, conscious contact with the parts of yourself you've been trained to hide. But before that, you have to understand what your brain thinks it's protecting you from and why it still believes it has to. At the core of persistent insecurity is a hidden strategy, one your brain uses to avoid uncertainty by clinging to self-doubt. It sounds paradoxical. Why would your mind choose to feel small? Because uncertainty is more threatening than limitation, and self-doubt, as painful as it is, offers something your brain can predict. A familiar role, a clear script, a reduced range of motion. Here's how it works. When you believe in yourself, you step into the unknown. You risk rejection, failure, misinterpretation. You open the door to disappointment and exposure. But when you doubt yourself first, when you preemptively shrink, downplay, or disengage, you get to control the outcome by lowering the stakes. This is not laziness. It's not a mindset issue. It's a neural efficiency strategy rooted in how the brain handles risk. Avoidance, in this context, isn't running away. It's staying within the bounds of what feels manageable, even if that means living below your potential. Because to the primitive brain, predictable pain is safer than uncertain possibility. This is why the urge to grow often comes with an equal urge to retreat. It's not that you don't want to evolve, it's that the moment you step outside of the emotional parameters your brain has practiced, it sounds the alarm. Careful, you've never been here before? And that warning signal. Anxieties, hesitation, fatigue gets misread as a sign. You're not ready when in truth. It's just a sign. You're leaving your old story behind. This is also why self-sabotage can feel so automatic. It's not a conscious choice. It's a moment when your nervous system hits an upper limit, a threshold where it no longer knows what safety looks like, so it pulls you back into a more familiar emotional posture. Insecurity, ambiguity, hesitation. Not because you're broken, but because your brain still believes the unknown is more dangerous than self-doubt. To rewrite that, you don't need to think more positively. You need to understand the cost your brain thinks it's avoiding, and gently retrain it to see that the discomfort of growth is not the same as a threat to your survival. When people talk about building confidence, they often reach for intensity. Say it louder, fake it harder, push through faster. But this approach only reinforces the same loop you're trying to escape. The belief that who you are isn't enough, unless it's covered by performance. That's why, when you try to act confident without resolving what's underneath, it feels hollow. The voice shakes. The posture stiffens. The smile strains. Because on some level, your nervous system knows you're performing over discomfort, not moving through it. This isn't your fault. The world rewards certainty. We're taught to project confidence, even if it means disconnecting from our real emotional state. But the body doesn't lie. And when the internal signal is, "I'm not safe being seen," no amount of external projection can silence that tension. This is why forced confidence often collapses the moment it's questioned. A small critique, a delayed response, a look that feels off, and suddenly, the whole structure cracks. Not because you weren't strong enough, but because your version of confidence was built on resistance, not regulation. You were trying to escape insecurity, not understand it. To silence the symptoms, instead of listening to the signal. True confidence doesn't begin with intensity. It begins with coherence. When your external presence matches your internal experience, not by being flawless, but by being honest, by standing in who you are without needing to inflate or shrink it. That coherence is what creates stability in the nervous system. It tells the brain, this version of me is allowed to exist. And over time, that permission becomes familiar. The tension softens. The voice stabilizes. The mind stops racing to predict rejection. You're not trying to become someone else. You're learning how to stay with yourself, even in moments where your old instincts tell you to disappear. And in that staying, confidence begins. Not as a performance, but as a felt sense of inner stability, built from the inside out. Somewhere along the way, you became someone your environment could accept. Not because you wanted to hide, but because being fully yourself felt too costly. So you adjusted, you observed, you adapted. Not all at once, but gradually, through 1,000 small choices. Tone, don't say that here. They like you better when you're this version. This is how the false self forms. Not as a lie, but as a survival mask. A version of you designed to reduce friction, minimize rejection, and maintain attachment. It's the part of you that learned to read the room before entering it. That learned which parts of you were too intense, too sensitive, too loud, too soft, and kept those parts hidden. And at the time, it worked. This adaptive version may have helped you belong, avoid conflict, get approval. But the longer you live inside it, the harder it becomes to know where it ends and where you begin. Over time, the false self becomes so practiced, so familiar, that even moments of joy or connection feel slightly disconnected. Like you're there, but not fully. Like you're speaking, but not saying what you mean. Like people like you, but not the version of you that never made it to the surface. This quiet disconnect is often misread as anxiety, awkwardness, or low self. But what you're actually feeling is self-abandonment in real time. Not just insecurity, but the tension of watching yourself disappear from your own life, slowly, politely, invisibly. And because this version of you has been reinforced for so long, praised, accepted, even rewarded, the idea of letting it go can feel threatening. Your brain says, why risk being rejected for your truth when this version already works? But that safety comes at a cost. The cost is presence. The cost is aliveness. The cost is never quite feeling at home in your own skin. To reclaim that, you don't have to destroy the false self. You have to gently stop depending on it, by noticing when it shows up, by allowing small truths to surface in safe moments, by slowly teaching your nervous system that you don't have to vanish to be loved. Rewiring doesn't start with ease. It starts with discomfort that makes sense. Not overwhelming, not destructive, but precise, conscious discomfort, the kind that shows you where your brain is still following old rules and invites you to stay present anyway. Here's the truth most people avoid. The first stages of healing feel wrong, not because they are, but because they contradict the emotional logic you've lived by for years. When you stop apologizing for existing, you feel rude. When you speak more directly, you feel cooled. When you take up more space, you feel selfish. These aren't signs you're doing it wrong. They're signs you're stepping into a new identity, and your nervous system hasn't caught up yet. Remember, the brain equates familiarity with safety. So when you act differently, even if the change is healthy, the initial response will feel like resistance. You might feel anxious, exposed, even guilty. And if you don't understand what's happening, you'll interpret that tension as proof you're not ready and retreat. But that tension is not a red light. It's the activation signal of neuroplasticity, your brain recognizing a pattern interruption and beginning to reorganize around a new possibility. The problem is, most people quit right there. They mistake that discomfort for danger and go back to what's known. They shrink, delay, overthink, not because they want to, but because they don't have a map for staying with themselves when everything inside says, don't. But you're not trying to get rid of discomfort. You're trying to learn how to stay conscious through it, to feel it fully without obeying it. To remind your body, this is new, not wrong. This is unfamiliar, not unsafe. This is me showing up instead of disappearing. That's where rewiring begins. Not in what you believe, but in how you behave when the old belief gets triggered, and you choose to stay anyway. Conscious exposure isn't about forcing yourself into situations that scare you. It's about showing your brain, one moment at a time, that you can survive being seen and that safety isn't earned by shrinking, it's reclaimed by presence. Imagine this. You're in a conversation, and that old reflex to edit yourself rises. You feel the familiar urge to soften your opinion, to second-guess your tone, to adjust your posture for approval. But this time, you don't rush to fix it. You notice the impulse. You pause, you stay. That pause is the rewiring, not because you're doing something dramatic, but because you're interrupting an unconscious loop and replacing it with choice. You're not pretending to be confident. You're retraining your nervous system to remain present in moments that used to activate automatic self. This is where true change happens, not in grand affirmations, but in these micro moments of self-permission. When you speak the full sentence, when you don't apologize for taking up space, when you let the silence be silence instead of rushing to fill it with justifications. Each of these moments tells your brain, I can be visible and safe. I don't need to perform to belong. I can trust myself even when I feel exposed. Over time, these experiences create new associations. The same situations that once triggered contraction now become proof points, evidence that presence is no longer a threat. And as those neural circuits strengthen, the old ones begin to fade. This is how neuroplasticity works. Through consistent, emotionally engaged repetition, not willpower, not pretending, the work is quiet. It's internal. It's the daily practice of not disappearing, even when part of you still wants to, because you know now, confidence isn't something you wait for. It's something you build by being honest. In the places where you used to hide, there's a difference between reacting to emotion and responding to it. Insecurity keeps you reactive, pulled by every glance, thrown off by every silence, shaped by imagined judgments that feel just as real as actual ones. You don't just feel emotion, you become it. And that collapse between feeling and identity is what makes it so hard to stay grounded. The antidote isn't detachment. It's emotional accuracy. The ability to notice what you're feeling without fusing with it. To say, this is insecurity, without saying, this is me. Because the more precisely you can name what's happening inside you, the less likely you are to abandon yourself in response to it. But most people never learn how to do this. They weren't taught how to be with discomfort, only how to solve it, suppress it, or perform around it. So when an emotional wave rises, tension in the chest, heat in the face, a surge of doubt, the instinct is to either overcompensate or retreat. That's how self-abandonment happens, not in loud, dramatic ways, but in small moments where you stop trusting your own signal. You say what sounds right instead of what you mean. You soften your truth to preserve harmony. You pretend you're okay because the feeling seems inconvenient. And every time you do that, your brain learns the same lesson. My internal state is not a reliable place to live. I need to adjust myself to match the outside. Over time, this builds a gap between who you are and who you think you need to be. That gap becomes your emotional fatigue. That fatigue becomes your confusion. And eventually, you don't know if you're insecure or just tired of constantly performing stability. This is why emotional accuracy matters, because it's the opposite of abandonment. It's how you stay connected to yourself, even when old patterns ask you to disappear. It's how you build a nervous system that doesn't collapse the moment discomfort enters the room, and it's how you begin to trust that your presence doesn't need to be edited, only understood. Something profound begins to shift when you stop shrinking. Not when you announce it, not when you try to become someone louder or bolder, but when, quietly and without apology, you let yourself take up the space you already occupy. It's subtle. You speak a little slower. You don't rush to explain yourself. You allow a pause to exist without trying to fix it. Not because you're trying to prove anything, but because you no longer feel the need to disappear. At first, this feels unnatural, like you're breaking a rule you never agreed to, but have followed your entire life. And, in a way, you are. Because for years, your brain has equated visibility with risk. And now, for the first time, you're showing up without a mask. Not louder, but more whole. This is when others begin to sense it, too, not in how much you say, but in the quality of your presence. There's a steadiness in your tone, a groundedness in your energy, a quiet clarity that doesn't demand attention but draws it in naturally. Because you're not performing safety anymore, you're embodying it. The mind begins to relax. The internal noise softens. You stop preparing for rejection that never comes. And even when discomfort arises, it no longer feels like a warning, just a wave that passes without needing a performance in return. This is not the high of false confidence. It's not a burst of energy or a temporary peak. It's the slow return of emotional stability, the kind that doesn't depend on external approval because it's built on internal coherence. You're not chasing presence anymore. You're remembering it, and in that remembering, something essential comes back online. The sense that you belong in your own life, fully, clearly, and without needing permission. The more you reclaim your presence, the less you depend on approval to feel real. And this is where real confidence lives. Not in control, not in dominance, but in the quiet, unshakable sense that you no longer need to be validated to exist. You begin to notice that you're not over-explaining anymore. You're not rehearsing conversations before or after they happen. You're not shrinking your truth to fit the expectations of people who haven't earned access to your inner world. And what takes the place of all that noise? Space, stillness, awareness. Not because life becomes easier, but because you are no longer negotiating with every moment to prove that you deserve to be here. This is what changes when you stop outsourcing yourself. You're not waiting for signs. You're not decoding silences or stretching yourself thin to manage someone else's perception. You are present, not because everything feels safe, but because you've learned how to create safety from within. And when the old thoughts return, did I say too much? Was I too direct? Did I come off the wrong way? You recognize them for what they are. Echoes of a former self, still trying to earn space that already belongs to you. You no longer argue with those thoughts. You don't fight them. You don't chase them away. You let them rise, and you stay anyway. Because you know, confidence isn't the absence of insecurity. It's the ability to remain in yourself, even when old fears whisper otherwise. This doesn't mean you become invulnerable. It means you stop abandoning yourself at the first sign of discomfort. And over time, what once felt like effort becomes your new baseline. You move through the world as someone who doesn't need to prove, only to be, because you've stopped negotiating with your presence. And that changes everything. Finally, confidence reveals itself as something far quieter than we imagined. Not a feeling to chase, not a mask to wear, but a return to a version of you that never needed to perform to be valid. It's not about feeling powerful in every room. It's about not needing to shrink in any of them. Not because you're certain of the outcome, but because you're no longer trying to predict it. You're just here, breathing, speaking, choosing, without running yourself through 1,000 filters first. Insecurity didn't begin as a flaw. It began as a strategy to stay safe, to be liked, to belong, and for a time, it worked. But what once protected you can now imprison you, unless you step in and show your brain a different path. That path isn't loud. It's consistent. You don't need to be fearless, just conscious. You don't need to feel ready, just willing to stay, even when part of you still doubts. And with each moment of presence, the old circuitry fades, not erased, but replaced by something truer. This is how you rewire. Not with tricks or hype, but with clarity, with the quiet conviction that your worth is not up for debate, with a steady return to yourself, one pause, one breath, one decision at a time. Confidence is not who you become. It's who you remember yourself to be when you finally stop leaving.